My name is Sophia Collins. I am 62 years old, and for most of my life I worked as a high school English teacher in a quiet town. I believed my purpose was simple: to nurture, to teach, to care. But nothing prepared me for the night my husband Edward died, suddenly leaving me not only a widow, but the target of my own son's betrayal. The call came at 10:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember checking the clock as the phone rang, thinking it was too late for good news. Edward had stayed at the office to finish reviewing quarterly reports. When I answered, there was only a voice I didn't recognize asking if I was Mrs. Collins' wife of Edward Collins. The rest blurred into fragments: collapse, emergency services, hospital, cardiac event. I drove through empty streets, the wheel slick beneath my palms, streetlights smearing past my windshield. My mind refused to process what was happening, clinging instead to the morning's mundane details: Edward adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, the smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen, his quick kiss on my cheek before the door closed behind him. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly, antiseptic and cold. A doctor met me, his face arranged in professional sympathy. His words fell like stones. Massive heart attack arrived too late. Nothing they could do. Just yesterday, Edward had been sitting across the breakfast table, telling me about a book he'd started. Now I was being led to a room to identify his body. He looked peaceful, as though merely sleeping. I reached for his hand, still warm but unresponsive. 40 years of marriage ended in an instant. 4 decades of shared breaths, morning coffees, whispered confidences, and quiet evenings distilled down to the stark absence of a pulse. I pressed my lips to his forehead, memorizing the feeling. Someone guided me to a chair. Forms appeared requiring signatures. A social worker spoke in gentle tones about arrangements, about grief counseling, about the next steps in a world that had lost its axis. I nodded mechanically, unable to comprehend how the mechanics of life continued when its meaning had vanished. I returned home to a house that felt cavernous in its emptiness. The jacket Edward had left draped over the chair that morning, his reading glasses on the side table, the book he would never finish, our bedroom with the indent of his head still visible on the pillow. These remnants of him, these physical traces, were suddenly precious beyond measure. Marcus arrived the next morning, his wife Lillian following with casseroles and sympathetic murmurs. My son embraced me awkwardly, patting my back with stiff motions. He had his father's height, but none of his warmth. Even in this moment of shared grief, I felt the distance between us, a gap that had been widening since he'd married and moved into corporate life. Lillian busied herself in the kitchen, rearranging things with the efficiency of someone taking control. She spoke in hushed tones to Marcus when they thought I couldn't hear words like arrangements and company matters floating through the doorway. Their presence should have been comforting, but something in their quick glances and sudden silences when I entered a room left me feeling more alone. The funeral home was Edward's choice, selected years ago during one of his practical planning phases. "No sense in burdening you with these decisions when the time comes," he'd said. The director greeted us with practiced solemnity, leading us through options for services, caskets, floral arrangements. Marcus took charge, immediately selecting the most expensive options, waving away my concerns about cost. We set the funeral for Saturday. 4 days to prepare for a formal goodbye to the man who had been my everything. I moved through them in a fog, answering calls, accepting deliveries of flowers, nodding at decisions Marcus made without consulting me. Lillian remained constantly at my elbow, her solicitousness feeling more like surveillance than support. Each night I retreated to our bedroom and curled around Edward's pillow, inhaling the fading scent of him. I would take out the green porcelain teacup he'd bought me on our honeymoon in Vermont, tracing its delicate handle with my fingertip. We'd been too poor for expensive gifts, but he'd insisted on buying this single beautiful thing. Something permanent, he'd said, to remind us of how we started. For 40 years it had been my morning ritual, that first cup of tea in the green porcelain, a daily remembrance of beginnings. The funeral dawned clear and crisp autumn sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the chapel air. I sat in the front row, the green teacup tucked carefully in my purse. I'd brought it as a talisman, a piece of our private history, amid the public ceremony. The chapel filled quickly. Edward had been respected in the community, his logistics company employing half the town. I recognized faces from company picnics, neighbors, old friends. Marcus and Lillian stood at the entrance greeting mourners with the practiced efficiency of hosts at a business function. Marcus shook hands firmly, his expression appropriately somber. Lillian touched arms, murmured condolences, her pearl earrings catching the light as she tilted her head in practiced sympathy. The service began with hymns, words about eternal rest and the kingdom of heaven. My lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, I stared at the casket draped in white lilies and thought of Edward's hands, hands that had once held mine so firmly, hands that had built furniture for our first apartment, hands that trembled slightly as he aged, but still reached for me across the bed each night. Marcus delivered the eulogy, his voice steady and controlled. He spoke of Edward's business acumen, the company he'd built from nothing, the respect he commanded in the industry. His words were polished, rehearsed, but strangely empty. Not once did he mention Edward's passion for woodworking, his terrible singing voice that he unleashed only when we were alone, his habit of leaving chocolate on my pillow on random Tuesdays because Tuesdays need the most sweetening. When it was my turn, my legs refused to carry me to the podium. I remained seated, the teacup pressed against my chest like a shield. My silence became my eulogy. In my heart, I recited the private litany of our marriage evenings on the porch swing, his laughter when I tried to cook French cuisine and failed spectacularly, the way he always brought me wildflowers on the first day of spring. After the service, I walked alone to the car. Behind me, I heard Marcus and Lillian already discussing upcoming social events with acquaintances, their voices carrying in the cemetery air. I watched them from a distance, struck by how quickly they had moved from mourning to networking. Edward was barely in the ground, and they were already planning the next chapter, as though his absence were merely an inconvenient interlude. That evening, the house filled with visitors bringing food and condolences. I moved through rooms like a ghost, accepting embraces, nodding at expressions of sympathy. Marcus and Lillian played host and hostess, expertly directing the flow of guests, ensuring glasses remained filled, accepting compliments on the service arrangements. I retreated to the kitchen at one point, needing a moment of solitude, and overheard Lillian speaking to a family friend. I need to get her through this initial shock, then we can discuss next steps. She's too fragile to make decisions right now. Her tone carried the indulgent patience one might use discussing an elderly relative's confusion. I was 62, not 92. I had spent 4 decades running our household, balancing budgets, making investment decisions alongside Edward. Yet in Lillian's assessment, I had been reduced to a helpless dependent, incapable of managing my own affairs. I slipped away unnoticed and climbed the stairs to our bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I took out the green teacup and held it to the light. The porcelain was translucent, delicate, yet surprisingly strong. Like me, I thought, easily underestimated. 1 week after the funeral, we gathered in the office of Michael Grant, Edward's lawyer. The space was warm with dark oak shelves and soft leather chairs, yet the air felt heavy, charged with unspoken tensions. Marcus sat rigidly beside Lillian, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the armrest. I clutched my purse containing the green teacup, my thumb rubbing its familiar edge through the leather. Michael greeted us with quiet respect, his silver hair catching the light from the window. He had been Edward's friend as well as his lawyer, their relationship stretching back to college days. He met my eyes with kindness before opening the folder on his desk, the gesture somehow reassuring. According to the final will and testament of Edward Collins, dated and notarized last year, the entirety of his estate is to be left to his wife, Sophia Collins. This includes all financial accounts, all properties, and his shares in the company totaling $33 million. The words hung in the air like suspended glass, fragile and dangerous. My breath caught not from surprise, Edward and I had discussed his wishes, but from the sudden tension that electrified the room. Before I could process the moment, Marcus exploded from his chair. This cannot be right. This has to be some kind of mistake. My father would never give it all to her. He built this company for me. I am his son. His face flushed, crimson veins visible at his temples. His fist came down hard against the polished wood, rattling pens and papers. The violence of his reaction startled me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. I had witnessed his entitlement, growing over the years, cultivated by Edward's indulgence and Lillian's ambitions. Michael remained unruffled. "There's no mistake, Marcus. Edward was of sound mind when this was written. Everything is quite clear." Lillian reached across the table, placing her manicured hand over mine. Her nails dug slightly into my skin, belying the sweetness in her voice. "Mother, listen to me. 33 million is more than you could ever need. You should sign everything over to us. Marcus knows how to handle these things. You're too old to manage this kind of wealth. Let us take care of it. You can still live comfortably. We'll make sure of that." Her words sliced deeper than Marcus's rage. Rage is raw and unfiltered. It shouts its truth. But Lillian's tone was calculated, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. She spoke of comfort while meaning control, of care while plotting containment. I sat in silence, my hands wrapped tighter around my purse, feeling the outline of the teacup within. My heart pounded, but my lips remained sealed. Every fiber of me wanted to remind them that I had stood beside Edward through every storm, that I had managed our household finances for decades, that I had supported his dreams when they were nothing but desperate hopes. But I knew shouting would only feed their hunger. Silence was my shield. Marcus paced the length of the room, gesturing wildly. "This is outrageous! Do you know how much I've invested in preparing for this? Father promised me a future. He told me the company would be mine one day." Edward had made no such promise. He had offered Marcus opportunities to prove himself, to demonstrate the values and work ethic that had built the company. Opportunities Marcus had consistently squandered, preferring shortcuts to the slow, steady growth his father had achieved. Michael remained steadfast. Edward left clear instructions. He wanted Sophia to have full control. This was his decision alone. Lillian leaned closer to me, her perfume sharp and invasive. "Please, Mother, think of the family. Think of Marcus's future, of the grandchildren. You don't need to carry this burden. Sign the papers and let us manage it all. You can stay in the house. We'll cover everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I looked at her, then at Marcus, and for the first time I saw them not as family, but as strangers. Strangers blinded by greed, deaf to love, blind to the memory of the man we had buried only days before. I pressed my purse tighter against my chest, my silence louder than any refusal. Michael closed the folder gently. "There's nothing more to discuss today. The will stands." He began gathering his papers, the meeting clearly concluded. As we rose from the table, Marcus's glare burned into me. "This isn't over. We'll talk at home." His words carried a threat, barely concealed, a promise of pressure to come. That evening, after a silent drive home, Marcus called and insisted I come to the dining room. His voice carried no warmth, no trace of the boy I had once read bedtime stories to, whose scrapes I had bandaged, whose triumphs I had celebrated. It was the voice of a man determined to win at any cost. Against my better judgment, I went. A part of me still hoped that reason, or perhaps love, might soften his heart. The dining room lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the polished oak table where we had shared countless family meals. Now it felt like a corporate boardroom, with Marcus seated at the head, Edward's place, and Lillian beside him. A stack of documents lay neatly arranged before them. Marcus slid the papers across the table toward me, his tone clipped and impatient. "Here, these are the transfer documents. All you need to do is sign. Then everything will be in its rightful place." I lowered myself into a chair, my fingers brushing against the edge of the papers. The legal jargon blurred before my eyes, but I understood enough. Signing would mean handing over everything Edward had entrusted to me. I looked up, keeping my voice soft, non-confrontational. This is not what your father wanted. Marcus's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Father was old. He wasn't thinking clearly. You know nothing about business. You never have. Do you really believe you can handle millions, run companies, manage investments? You've lived in the shadow of this family your whole life. It's time to be realistic. His words stung, but I let them sink in quietly. For years, I had endured the subtle reminders that I was not enough, that I was merely the supporting figure behind Edward's success. Now, those reminders were spoken without disguise, thrown at me like stones. Lillian leaned forward, her voice coated with artificial concern. Mother, we're trying to help you. Imagine the embarrassment if you mismanage all this. People will talk. They'll say Edward's fortune was wasted. You don't need that shame. Just sign. We'll protect you. I picked up the pen, rolling it between my fingers. For a moment, I let them think I was considering it. Their eyes lit up with anticipation, already calculating their victory. Then I placed the pen gently back on the table. No. The word was quiet, almost fragile, but it carried the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made. For a second, the room fell into stunned silence. Marcus's face twisted with fury, and Lillian's smile cracked, revealing the disdain beneath. Marcus slammed his fist onto the table, sending the pen skittering across the wood. You don't get to say no. You owe me this. You owe this family. Everything you had was because of Father and because of me. You will sign or you will regret it. I rose from the chair slowly, my movements deliberate, controlled. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue, I simply walked past him toward the hallway where my purse still sat by the door. My silence was louder than any scream. Marcus followed me, his steps heavy, his shadow stretching long across the floor. If you walk out of here without signing, don't bother coming back. You're finished here. You are nothing without us. I bent down, picked up my purse, and felt for the reassuring outline of the teacup within. Then I straightened, meeting his eyes. For a moment, I saw not the man he had become, but the boy who once held my hand crossing the street. The memory ached in my chest, but it did not weaken my resolve. I am not signing. His jaw tightened. He pointed toward the door, his voice like ice. Then go, right now, tonight. Don't take another step in this house unless you come back with those papers signed. Lillian stood in the doorway, her arms folded, watching me as though I were a tenant being evicted rather than the woman who had raised her husband. Her silence confirmed what I already knew. There was no place for me here anymore, so I walked. My footsteps echoed through the long hallway, my shadow stretching small and fragile against the tall walls. Each step was heavy, yet strangely freeing. I had entered that house as a widow, still clinging to the hope of family. I left it as something else entirely. Exiled, yes, but carrying with me the only thing that mattered, the truth of Edward's trust, and the quiet strength to honor it. I paused at the bedroom door, considering what to take. The logical part of my mind catalogued necessities, clothing, toiletries, medication, but my heart reached for different treasures: the photo album from our early years, Edward's cardigan that still carried his scent, the small wooden box he had carved for our 10th anniversary. I filled a single suitcase, moving with the efficiency of someone who understands that the truly valuable things are seldom the largest. Last, I wrapped the green porcelain teacup in one of Edward's handkerchiefs and tucked it carefully on top. My hands lingered on the lid of the suitcase before closing it. 40 years of marriage reduced to what I could carry. The night air was cool against my face as I walked to the car. The neighborhood was quiet, windows glowing with the warm light of families together. I wondered how many houses concealed their own silent wars, their own betrayals disguised as concern. The car started on the first try. Edward had always insisted on meticulous maintenance. "It's the small things that carry you through emergencies," he would say. Another piece of wisdom I was now grateful for. I drove without a clear destination, at first muscle memory guiding me through familiar streets that suddenly seemed alien. The reality of my situation began to sink in. At 62, I was effectively homeless. My son had cast me out of my own home. My daughter-in-law had watched it happen without objection. The life I had known had evaporated in a week. As I reached the highway, clarity came. There was one place I could go, one refuge Edward and I had created years ago when the company was still young and our dreams still uncertain. I turned north toward the lake, toward the cabin that had been our escape from the pressures of growing success. The drive took nearly 2 hours, the headlights cutting through darkness, illuminating empty roads and sleeping towns. My mind circled through memories, through arguments I should have made, words I should have said. But beneath the second guessing ran a steadier current. I had made the right choice. Edward had trusted me. I would not betray that trust. The cabin appeared at the end of a winding gravel road, its silhouette dark against the night sky. We had purchased it 25 years ago, a simple structure of wood and stone overlooking the water. Edward had called it our investment in sanity, a place where board meetings and social obligations couldn't follow. We'd spent less time there in recent years, as Edward's health began to decline, but we'd never considered selling it. "Some anchors you keep," he'd said, "even when you're not actively using them." The key was where we always kept it, hidden in a false rock near the front steps. My fingers found it by touch, familiar despite the years. The door groaned open, releasing the smell of pine and dust of disuse and memory. I stepped inside, feeling my way through darkness to the old kerosene lamp we kept on the entry table. The flame caught, casting a warm glow across the sheet-draped furniture. I moved through the space like a ghost, returning to familiar haunts, pulling covers from the sofa, the dining table, the stone fireplace that dominated the main room. Everything was as we had left it during our last visit 2 summers ago. Fishing rods leaning in the corner, Edward's collection of Western novels lining the shelves, the quilt I had made for our 15th anniversary folded at the foot of the bed. The cabin had no central heating, relying instead on the massive fireplace and a wood stove in the bedroom. Edward had always insisted on leaving a stack of firewood inside, wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. "Just in case," he'd say, "we ever need to come here in winter." His foresight now seemed prophetic. I built a fire with practiced movements, arranging kindling and logs in the pattern Edward had taught me. As flames caught and grew, warmth began to push back against the chill. I pulled the quilt from the bedroom and wrapped it around my shoulders, then sat in the old armchair facing the fire. For the first time since the hospital, I allowed myself to fully feel the weight of what had happened. Edward was gone. My son had revealed himself to be a stranger. My home was no longer mine. The life I had built over decades had crumbled in a matter of days. The grief came in waves, not just for Edward now, but for the family I thought I had, for the future I had imagined. I reached for my purse and carefully unwrapped the green teacup. In the firelight, its glaze shimmered with hidden depth, the slight chip near the handle, evidence of its journey through our life together. I held it to my chest, this small, fragile thing that had outlasted so much. "This is our place, Ellie, where nothing can touch us. No expectations, no demands, just you and me." Edward's voice seemed to whisper from the crackling flames, from the familiar creaks of the cabin settling around me. For him, the cabin was more than wood and stone. It was proof that we could carve out a corner of the world for ourselves, even when the world tried to take everything else. I leaned back, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, and whispered into the air, "I'm still here, Edward, and I will keep what you gave me. I will not let them take it away." My voice cracked, barely audible, but the cabin seemed to hold the words as though the walls themselves were listening. The firelight danced across the teacup, making the porcelain glow with inner light. I set it carefully on the small table beside me, leaving it there like a sentinel. A small object, yet it had survived every storm with us. Now it would survive this one, too. I closed my eyes, listening to the fire and the faint lapping of waves against the shore below. For the first time since Edward's death, I did not feel completely lost. Broken, yes. Alone, yes. But not erased. As long as I could breathe in the scent of pine, as long as the fire burned in the hearth, as long as the teacup remained, a part of him would live with me here. Outside, the lake lay still, reflecting the cold glow of the moon. The world beyond this cabin might already be sharpening its claws, but here, for one night at least, I felt protected. And in that fragile protection, I made a silent promise I would not give in. I would not let Marcus and Lillian erase me as they wished. This cabin would be my ground, my refuge, and tomorrow, whatever storm came, I would face it. The morning broke cold and gray, the lake shrouded in thin mist that clung to the surface like reluctant ghosts. I had slept fitfully, waking often to add logs to the dying fire, each time momentarily disoriented before remembering where I was and why. My body ached from the unfamiliar bed and the emotional exhaustion of the previous day. I made my way to the small kitchen, searching cupboards for anything non-perishable. We always left basic supplies, coffee, tea, canned goods, for unexpected visits. The tea was stale but drinkable. I boiled water on the old gas stove and prepared a cup in the chipped mug we kept there, saving the green porcelain teacup for a moment when I could properly honor its significance. The cabin felt different in daylight, smaller, more vulnerable, its age evident in the worn floorboards and faded curtains. Yet it was solid, built by craftsmen who understood how to make things last. The large windows overlooking the lake bathed the main room in diffuse light, illuminating dust motes that danced in still air. I sat at the small wooden table near the window, warming my hands around the mug, watching as mist slowly lifted from the water. In that moment of quiet, I could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that Edward might walk through the door at any moment, complaining about the cold and heading straight for the coffee. But the illusion shattered at the sound of vehicles approaching, tires crunching on gravel, car doors slamming with deliberate force. Voices carried through the trees, sharp and determined. I set the mug down gently, my hand steady, despite the sudden pounding in my chest. Through the window, I saw them. Marcus, Lillian, and two of Edward's cousins, distant relatives who appeared only at holiday gatherings and who had always been more interested in Edward's success than his friendship. They strode across the yard like a delegation, their polished shoes and tailored coats incongruous against the rustic setting. They spoke loudly, not bothering to lower their voices as though volume itself could establish ownership. The front door shook as Marcus pounded his fist against it. "Open up, mother! We're done playing games. This cabin belongs to the family. Hand it over now." I did not move immediately. Instead, I sat still, letting silence gather around me like armor. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but still radiated gentle warmth. After a long pause, I rose, walked to the door, and opened it slowly. They surged forward, ready to push past me. Marcus's face was tight with fury, his eyes blazing. "Step aside. You have no right to be here. Father never meant for you to have everything. This ends now." Behind him, Lillian crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. She spoke in that same honeyed voice, each word dripping with condescension. "Mother, this is embarrassing. Neighbors could see. Just sign the transfer papers and make this simple. You're clinging to something you cannot possibly handle." I remained calm, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "This cabin was Edward's refuge. He left it to me. I am exactly where he wanted me to be." Marcus took a step closer, towering over me. "If you won't sign, we'll make you leave one way or another." Before I could respond, a firm voice echoed from behind me. "That would be a mistake, Marcus." The atmosphere shifted instantly. From the hallway, Jonathan Hale stepped forward. His tall frame was unmistakable, his presence commanding. Jonathan had been Edward's partner from the very beginning, co-founder of the company, and his loyalty to Edward had never wavered. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder before turning his gaze on Marcus. "Your father told me everything. He trusted your mother to carry his legacy, not you. If you try to take this by force, you will dishonor everything he built." Marcus froze, momentarily stunned. He had not expected to see Jonathan here, but before he could recover, another figure entered through the open doorway. Sheriff Cole, a broad-shouldered man with a lined face that spoke of years enforcing the law in this county, tipped his hat politely to me before fixing his eyes on Marcus. "I heard some troubling talk, son. Threats, coercion. If you attempt to force your mother out of her own property, I will have no choice but to act. You may think this is just a family dispute, but under the law, it's trespassing and attempted theft." The air went heavy. Marcus's bravado faltered, his face paling slightly. He glanced back at the cousins who had come with him, but they avoided his eyes, suddenly very interested in the pattern of pine needles on the ground. Lillian, however, stepped forward, her voice sharp now, no longer sweet. "Sheriff, this is a private matter. You have no right to interfere." Sheriff Cole's eyes narrowed. "When someone threatens a citizen of this county on their own property, it becomes my matter. Consider this your warning." Silence fell. The only sound was the occasional snap of embers in the fireplace behind me and the wind rustling through the pines outside. I stood still, my back straight, my hands steady. I did not need to shout. The presence of Jonathan and the sheriff spoke louder than any words I could offer. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice low but venomous. "Fine. You think you can hide behind lawyers and old friends? This isn't over. We'll take this to court, and when we do, you'll lose. You cannot stand against us forever." He turned sharply, gesturing for the others to follow. Lillian's glare lingered on me for a moment before she pivoted on her heel, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke. The sound of their retreating footsteps faded across the gravel, followed by engines starting and vehicles pulling away. I closed the door gently, leaning against it for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just passed. The battle was no longer confined to whispered conversations or slammed fists on tables. It had become something larger, something that would play out in public under the scrutiny of the law. Jonathan placed a steady hand on my arm. "Edward trusted you, Sophia, and now it's time for you to trust yourself." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "Don't let them scare you. You have more strength than you know." I returned to the small table, lifted the mug once more, and let the warmth steady me. Outside, the mist over the lake began to lift, revealing clear water beneath. Their threats lingered, but so did something else. A quiet resolve growing stronger with every breath I took. When Jonathan and Sheriff Cole had gone, promising to return the next day, I sat alone in the cabin that was now my only home. The sudden silence after their departure felt both peaceful and heavy with implication. I moved to the bedroom and unpacked my small suitcase, hanging clothes in the cedar closet that still held a few of Edward's flannel shirts from our last visit. The simple act of arranging my belongings, placing my hairbrush on the dresser, lining up my shoes beneath the bed, felt like a declaration. This space was mine now, not just legally, but emotionally. A refuge, yes, but also a battleground I had chosen. I returned to the main room and carefully unwrapped the green porcelain teacup. I washed it in the small kitchen sink, dried it with care, and made a proper cup of tea. The ritual was comforting, a small piece of normality in a world turned upside down. I sat by the window watching afternoon light play across the lake's surface and tried to imagine what Edward would advise. He had always approached problems, methodically breaking them down into manageable parts. "Panic never solved anything," he would say. "Take a breath, make a list, then start at the top." So I found an old notebook in the desk drawer and began to write contact bank, forward mail, find local doctor, the practical matters that would anchor me here. But beneath these tasks lay larger questions. How would I defend against Marcus's legal challenge? What evidence did I have of Edward's intentions beyond the will itself? Why had he chosen to leave everything to me rather than dividing it? I knew Edward. His decision would not have been made lightly or without careful thought. There must be reasons, preparations I didn't yet understand. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, I heard another vehicle approaching. My heart quickened, fearing Marcus had returned with reinforcements, but the knock that came was gentle, respectful. I opened the door to find Jonathan alone this time, carrying a cardboard box and a grocery bag. He smiled apologetically. "I thought you might need supplies, and Edward asked me to bring you this if things went the way he feared they might." I stepped aside to let him enter, intrigued and slightly unsettled by his words. Edward had anticipated this situation, had prepared for it. The thought was both comforting and painful. He had known what might happen after he was gone, had foreseen his son's reaction. Jonathan set the groceries on the kitchen counter, then placed the box carefully on the dining table. It was sealed with packing tape, my name written on top in Edward's distinctive handwriting. Jonathan stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets. He knew Marcus would fight the will. He told me last year that if anything happened to him, I should watch out for you. Make sure you weren't pressured. I didn't think it would come to this, Sophia. Not so quickly or so cruelly. I stared at the box, not yet ready to open it. How could Edward have known? When did he realize what Marcus had become? Jonathan sighed, sitting heavily in one of the dining chairs. It started about 3 years ago. Marcus began pushing for more control of the company, demanding Edward step aside. When Edward suggested he needed to prove himself, first demonstrate the values the company was built on, Marcus grew hostile, said Edward was holding him back out of spite. It got ugly. The revelation stung. 3 years of conflict I hadn't known about. Edward had shielded me from it, carried that burden alone. Or had I simply not wanted to see the truth about our son? Edward believed in second chances, Jonathan continued. He kept hoping Marcus would mature, would understand that a legacy isn't just about money or power. It's about values, about how you treat people. He held off on changing his will until last year, when he trailed off looking uncomfortable. I urged him to continue, needing to hear the full truth now. When Marcus tried to force a company restructuring that would have cut benefits for long-term employees, men and women who'd been with us from the beginning. Edward blocked it, and Marcus threatened to take legal action against his own father. That's when Edward knew. He revised the will the next day. The picture was becoming clearer, the puzzle pieces falling into place. Edward's decision wasn't about excluding Marcus or privileging me. It was about protecting people, about preserving the company culture he had built over decades. Jonathan rose to leave, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Open the box when you're ready. And Sophia, don't face this alone. Edward made sure you'd have allies. Use them." After he left, I sat at the table staring at the box, my hands resting lightly on its sealed top. Whatever it contained represented Edward's final message to me, his guidance from beyond the grave. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Another part feared what I might find. Finally, as the last light faded from the sky and the cabin grew dark, except for the glow of the fire, I cut the tape and lifted the lid. Inside lay several items: a thick legal folder, a small USB drive, an envelope with my name, and a framed photograph I'd never seen before. Edward and me at the cabin, years ago, laughing together on the dock, unaware of the camera. Jonathan must have taken it. I opened the envelope first, hands trembling slightly. Edward's handwriting filled the page, familiar and dear. "My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this, I'm gone and things have unfolded as I feared they might. I'm sorry for the burden this places on you. More sorry than I can express that our son has chosen a path I cannot follow or endorse. You're probably wondering why I left everything to you rather than dividing it. The answer is simple. I trust you. I trust your judgment, your compassion, your understanding of what the company means to the people who work there. Marcus sees only profits and power. You see human beings. In the folder, you'll find everything you need to defend my decision. Medical evaluations proving I was of sound mind, documentation of concerning actions Marcus has taken. The USB drive contains video testimony I've recorded explaining my choices. Michael has copies as well. This won't be easy, Sophia. Marcus will fight, and he'll fight dirty. But you are stronger than you know. You've always been my foundation, my conscience, my heart. Now I need you to be my voice as well. Remember our promise to each other to live with purpose, to help where we can, to leave something good behind. Whatever you decide to do with what I've left you, whether you run the company, sell it, or transform it, I know you'll honor that promise. All my love for all time. Edward. I pressed the letter to my chest, tears flowing freely now. Edward had known, had prepared, had trusted me to carry forward what mattered most to him. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, the lake whispered against the shore, and inside the cabin something shifted in me, grief giving way to resolve, confusion to clarity. I carefully returned the letter to its envelope and placed it beside the green teacup. 2 days after the confrontation at the cabin, I heard the crunch of tires again. This time it was not Marcus or Lillian. A courier stepped out dressed neatly in a navy jacket carrying an envelope with my name typed neatly across the front. He handed it to me without a word, then turned and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust trailing behind him. I stood in the doorway, the envelope trembling slightly in my hands. I already knew what it was before I tore it open. The summons. Marcus and Lillian had filed suit to challenge Edward's will. They were demanding it be declared invalid, claiming undue influence, claiming Edward had not been of sound mind when he signed it. My knees weakened and I sank into the chair by the fireplace. The green porcelain teacup sat on the table untouched since morning. I reached for it now, wrapping my fingers around its handle as though it might keep me from unraveling. The paper in my other hand felt heavier than its weight, like a stone pressing down on my chest. The words blurred as I read them, but the meaning cut clear. They were trying to erase Edward's final choice, to erase me from the story of his life. Fear coursed through me, sharp and hot, leaving me trembling. I had never been in a courtroom except for jury duty. The thought of standing there while my own son tried to dismantle my place in Edward's legacy filled me with dread. Yet beneath the fear, something steadier began to take root. A memory surfaced, unbidden but vivid. Edward and Marcus, standing in the company office years ago, their voices raised. Marcus had been in his early 30s, then ambitious but reckless. He had demanded a controlling share of the company. "You built this for me, Dad. It should already be mine." Edward's voice had been firm, unyielding. "I built this with Jonathan, and I built it for the employees who gave their lives to it. I didn't build it so you could strip it bare. If you want a place here, you'll earn it the way I did." Marcus had stormed out that day, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Edward had turned to me afterward, shaking his head. His eyes were heavy with sorrow, not anger. "He doesn't understand, Sophia. He sees wealth as a prize, not a responsibility. One day, that difference will matter." Now, sitting in the cabin with the summons in my lap, I realized Edward had known this day would come. He had seen it clearly, the storm that was now crashing down upon me. I lifted the teacup to my lips, the steam curling against my face, and whispered into the empty room. "You saw this day, didn't you, Edward? You knew they would come for me, and still you trusted me." The fire cracked in response, as though echoing his voice. Tears threatened, but I held them back. Grief had already taken so much of my strength. I could not let fear take the rest. Slowly, I folded the summons and placed it back in the envelope. Then I set it beside the teacup, the two objects side by side, one representing the battle ahead, the other the bond that could not be broken. I sat there for hours, letting the silence of the cabin settle around me until resolve began to harden like stone within me. I was not naive. I knew the courtroom would be brutal. They would question my worth, my role as Edward's wife, even my sanity. But I also knew something they did not. Edward's faith in me was not misplaced. He had chosen me for a reason. He had seen not just the shadow I thought I was, but the quiet strength he believed in. I traced the rim of the teacup with my finger, feeling the smooth porcelain. It had survived decades of use, cracks, threatening, but never breaking. In it, I saw myself, worn, yes, weathered, yes, but unbroken. Tomorrow I would call Michael. Tomorrow I would begin to prepare. Tonight I allowed myself to grieve once more, not for Edward's death, but for the son I had already lost long before he filed this lawsuit. The summons lay on the table like a gauntlet thrown at my feet. I would not walk away. I would not surrender. If they wanted a courtroom battle, then they would have it, and I would face it not as a shadow, but as Edward's chosen heir. The morning after I received the summons, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a war room. I swept the dust from the dining table and lit a fire in the hearth. The crackle of the flames steadied me, as though Edward himself was reminding me not to tremble. By noon, Michael arrived carrying a heavy leather briefcase and 3 words that changed everything. Edward anticipated this. He set the case down on the table and looked at me with determined eyes. His silver hair caught the morning light streaming through the windows, giving him an almost ethereal appearance. The cabin, which had seemed so empty the night before, now hummed with purpose. Edward was nothing if not thorough. He knew Marcus would challenge the will, and he prepared for every contingency. Michael's confidence was reassuring, but the reality of what lay ahead still knotted my stomach. I had spent my life in classrooms guiding students through literature and grammar. Courtrooms were foreign territory battlegrounds where words became weapons and truth sometimes mattered less than presentation. From the briefcase, Michael drew a stack of documents, spreading them neatly across the table. At the top was a medical file stamped and signed. He tapped the page with his finger. This is from Dr. Patel, Edward's physician. Less than 2 months before he passed, Edward underwent a full cognitive evaluation. He was sharp, fully competent, and the doctor recorded that explicitly. This alone dismantles any claim of incapacity. I traced the letters with my fingertips, a wave of relief rising in me. The clinical language described Edward exactly as I had known him: mentally acute decision-making capacity intact, no evidence of cognitive impairment. Marcus and Lillian's accusations suddenly felt smaller, as though the truth itself was lifting me above their reach. Michael reached again into the briefcase and produced a small USB drive. He held it delicately, almost reverently. And this is Edward's voice. We set the laptop on the table, and when the screen flickered to life, I saw him. Edward sitting in his office, framed by shelves of books I knew so well. His eyes, though tired, held the same unwavering clarity I had known all my life. His voice filled the cabin, steady and calm. If you are watching this, it means I am gone. Marcus, if you are challenging my decision, know that I made it with full heart and mind. Sophia has been the foundation of this family, the one who held it together when I was consumed by the company. I trust her judgment beyond anyone else's. My fortune, my shares, our home, it belongs to her, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it with every quiet sacrifice. I covered my mouth with my hand, my breath breaking. It was Edward not just leaving me wealth, but leaving me his voice to shield me when mine faltered. I whispered into the quiet room. You thought of everything, didn't you? Before I could sink deeper into emotion, another knock came at the cabin door. Jonathan Hale stepped in carrying a slim folder under his arm. He greeted Michael with a nod and came to sit across from me. His presence alone carried a weight Marcus could never match. He slid the folder across the table. These are the partnership agreements. Edward transferred decisive voting power to you over his shares last year. He wanted to make sure Marcus couldn't strong-arm his way into control. This document makes it ironclad. I opened it carefully. There, in black and white, Edward's signature rested beside Jonathan's, affirming what he had already told me countless times in private, that the company was not just Marcus's inheritance to exploit, but a legacy to be protected. As the weight of that sank in, a third visitor entered. Sheriff Cole, his hat in his hands, stood in the doorway with a solemn nod. Mrs. Collins, I'm here to put my word on record. I witnessed Marcus threaten you at this cabin. If they want to drag this into court, I will testify. A son's greed does not erase the law. For a long moment I could not speak. I looked at the three men gathered around my table, Edward's lawyer, his partner, and the sheriff, and felt the strength of their loyalty pressing against the shadows that had haunted me. The papers, the video, the signatures, the witnesses, it was all here. Edward had left me more than fortune. He had left me enough to stand firm to weather the storm Marcus and Lillian were bringing. I reached for the green teacup and held it steady in my hands. The porcelain was warm from the tea I had poured earlier, the faint steam curling upward. I looked into its surface and whispered, Edward, you prepared me for this. You knew the day would come, and you made sure I wouldn't stand alone. The fire crackled in the hearth. Michael, Jonathan, and Sheriff Cole sat quietly, their presence as strong as the evidence spread across the table. For the first time since the summons arrived, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but resolve. I placed the teacup back on the table beside Edward's documents and straightened my back. Let's prepare. Tell me everything I need to know about what happens next. Michael spent the next hour explaining the legal process. He outlined how wills could be contested, the burden of proof required, and the timeline we could expect. In cases of undue influence, the challenger must prove the testator, Edward, was susceptible to manipulation and that someone took advantage of that vulnerability. With the medical documentation and video testimony, such claims would be difficult to sustain. Advance directives, power of attorney, healthcare proxies. These are critical documents when planning an estate. Edward was meticulous about them all. His estate plan included not just the will, but trusts, business succession plans, and charitable designations, everything properly witnessed and notarized. The technical terms swirled around me, but I forced myself to absorb them. This was no longer Edward's battlefield. It was mine. I needed to understand every weapon at my disposal. Jonathan explained the business aspects. Edward had restructured the company ownership last year, establishing a trust that would prevent hasty sales or asset stripping. The voting shares I now controlled came with responsibility, not just to shareholders, but to employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's stability. The business isn't just about profit margins, Sophia. Edward built it on relationships, on trust. There are families that have worked for us for 3 generations. Marcus wanted to streamline operations, cut the workforce by 30%, outsourced to cheaper markets. Edward blocked him at every turn. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Edward's decision to exclude Marcus wasn't about disinheriting a son, it was about protecting hundreds of people from a man who saw them as expendable resources rather than the heart of the company. Sheriff Cole offered practical advice about security: change the locks at the cabin, install motion-activated lights, keep a record of any communication from Marcus or Lillian. His pragmatic suggestions made the threat feel more real, but also more manageable. There were concrete steps I could take, actions within my control. By late afternoon, a plan was taking shape. Michael would file our response to the summons. Jonathan would handle company matters, keeping me informed but not overwhelmed. Sheriff Cole would increase patrols near the cabin, and I would prepare myself for what promised to be a brutal public examination of my marriage, my character, and my worth. After they left, I stood on the cabin porch watching the sun sink toward the lake. The water reflected gold and crimson beauty that seemed at odds with the battle brewing around me. I had always been a private person, content to support from the background. Now I would be thrust center stage, my life dissected by strangers. That evening, I received the first call from a friend in town. Barbara, who had taught mathematics at the same high school, her voice unnaturally bright. "Sophia, I just wanted to check how you're doing. There are some stories going around. I'm sure it's nothing but—" The hesitation in her voice told me everything. The rumors had already begun. I braced myself. What kind of stories, Barbara? Her discomfort was palpable, even through the phone. Just some talk about Edward not being himself toward the end, and something about you isolating him from the family. But I told everyone that doesn't sound like you at all. The campaign had begun. Marcus was laying groundwork, turning public opinion against me before we ever reached a courtroom. I thanked Barbara for her loyalty and ended the call with a steadiness I didn't feel. 3 more calls followed that evening, each friend more uncomfortable than the last, each reporting more troubling rumors. I was manipulative. I had taken advantage of Edward's declining health. I had always been jealous of Marcus's relationship with his father. The stories grew more outlandish, more hurtful, each designed to paint me as a villain who had stolen what rightfully belonged to a grieving son. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire watching flames consume logs until only embers remained, thinking about the community I had called home for decades. People I had taught, worked alongside, shared meals with. How quickly would they believe the worst of me? How deep did loyalty run? When tested by salacious gossip, morning brought a new challenge. An email from Lillian, her words dripping with false concern. "Mother, we're worried about your mental state. Living alone in that drafty old cabin can't be good for your health. Marcus and I have arranged for you to be evaluated by a specialist. Dr. Winters can see you Thursday at 2 p.m. We'll pick you up. This will help the court understand your current capacity to manage such complex financial matters." The manipulation was transparent. They wanted to create evidence of incompetence to establish a narrative of a confused widow unable to handle her affairs. I forwarded the email to Michael without responding to Lillian. His reply came within minutes. Do not agree to any evaluation they arrange. Will counter with an independent assessment if necessary. This is a common tactic, creating evidence to support their claims. We're dealing with smart adversaries. Be cautious, smart, and ruthless. Marcus knew the community, knew which strings to pull, which fears to exploit. He had been watching and learning his entire life, not Edward's business ethics or community values, but how to identify vulnerabilities and capitalize on them. By week's end, I could feel the town turning against me. The woman at the small grocery store, 10 miles from the cabin, who had always chatted warmly, now avoided eye contact. The attendant at the gas station, who had known Edward for years, suddenly couldn't remember my name, small cutting indicators that the whisper campaign was working. I received a letter from my church, the congregation I had belonged to for 30 years. The pastor expressed concerns raised by members about my absence and suggested grief counseling. Between the lines lay the implication people were talking, questioning, judging. The isolation might have broken me if not for unexpected allies. A package arrived from my former students, dozens of cards expressing support, remembering kindnesses I had shown them years ago. The cashier at the hardware store slipped me a note. My dad worked for Mr. Collins for 25 years. He says you're good people, and that's good enough for us. The local librarian called to inform me she'd reserved a private study room whenever I needed space away from gossip. Each small act of faith strengthened me for what came next. Michael called to inform me that Marcus had escalated his strategy. He had approached several long-term employees offering incentives for damaging testimony about Edward's mental state or my influence over him. Most refused, but money talks, Sophia. We should be prepared for at least a few to accept his offer. People have mortgages, medical bills, children's educations to consider. I understood the impossible choices some might face. Edward had always said that true character reveals itself under pressure. Now I was witnessing that truth firsthand, both the disappointing capitulations and the surprising courage of ordinary people. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following week. A mediation session was mandated before the case could proceed to trial, standard procedure in contested will cases. We would face Marcus and Lillian across a conference table with a court-appointed mediator attempting to find middle ground. I spent the weekend rehearsing answers to the questions Michael warned might come. The process felt familiar, like planning a difficult lesson for students who resisted learning. I had taught literature for decades. Stories of human conflict, moral choices, justice delayed and denied. Now I was living within such a narrative, no longer the observer, but the protagonist. The morning of the mediation, I dressed carefully in clothes Edward had always complimented. A navy suit with a silk scarf, simple pearl earrings he had given me on our 25th anniversary. I wanted to feel him with me, his approval surrounding me like armor. The courthouse loomed gray and imposing against the autumn sky. Michael met me at the entrance, his briefcase bulging with documents. He guided me through security and down a long corridor to a conference room where the mediator waited. A woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner, she introduced herself as Judge Belmont, retired from the bench, but still serving in dispute resolution. Marcus and Lillian arrived exactly on time, both dressed as though for a corporate board meeting. Marcus wore a charcoal suit that emphasized his resemblance to Edward, a similarity that felt like appropriation. Lillian's designer outfit and careful makeup created an impression of polished professionalism. They nodded coolly in my direction but did not speak. Judge Belmont explained the process. This was not a formal hearing, but an opportunity to explore resolution without the expense and emotional toll of a trial. Everything said remained confidential. She would not make rulings, but would guide discussion toward potential compromise. The formality cracked as soon as Marcus began speaking. His carefully constructed facade of reasonableness slipped, revealing the anger beneath. My father built Collins Logistics from nothing. 40 years of his life, his vision. He always intended for me to take over. But in his final months, when his health was failing, suddenly everything changed. Suddenly, my mother, who never set foot in the company offices, who knows nothing about logistics or business management, inherits everything. This defies not just his lifelong intentions, but common sense. Judge Belmont turned to me, her expression neutral. Mrs. Collins, would you like to respond? I had rehearsed a dozen different answers, prepared counter-arguments, and evidence. But sitting across from my son, seeing the stranger, he had become a different response emerged. When Edward and I married, we had nothing but student debt and a used car. The company didn't exist. We built our lives together, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. I may not have sat in board meetings, but I balanced our household accounts when we couldn't afford office staff. I entertained clients in our home when we couldn't afford restaurants. I listened to every worry, celebrated every victory, weathered every setback. For 40 years, I was the foundation that allowed Edward to take risks to focus on his vision. He trusted me with his deepest fears and his greatest hopes. That trust didn't end with his death. The room fell silent. Judge Belmont nodded slightly, then turned back to Marcus. Mr. Collins, what specific concerns do you have about your mother's management of the estate? Marcus leaned forward, his fingers interlaced on the table. She has no experience with corporate governance, no understanding of the market pressures we're facing. The company requires decisive leadership, strategic vision. With all due respect to my mother's domestic contributions. Running a multinational logistics corporation is somewhat different from balancing a checkbook. The condescension in his voice burned like acid. I kept my expression neutral, refusing to show the hurt. Lillian placed her hand on Marcus's arm, a gesture meant to appear supportive, but clearly designed to remind him to maintain his composure. Judge Belmont turned to Michael. Does Mrs. Collins intend to take an active management role in the company? Michael had prepared me for this question. We had discussed my options, the various arrangements possible, from active leadership to appointing professional management while maintaining ownership. Mrs. Collins understands the responsibility she has inherited. She has retained the existing executive team and has been meeting regularly with Mr. Hale, the co-founder, to ensure continuity. She has no intention of making hasty changes or decisions without proper consultation. Marcus scoffed. So she'll be a figurehead manipulated by Hale and whoever else gains her ear. That's hardly reassuring for shareholders or employees. Judge Belmont raised an eyebrow at his tone, but continued methodically. Mr. Collins, what resolution are you seeking here? This was the moment of truth. What did Marcus actually want? Was there any compromise that might satisfy him? Marcus exchanged glances with Lillian before answering. I should be appointed CEO with controlling interest in the company. My mother can retain the house and a generous monthly allowance. The cabin and other properties should transfer to me as well. This arrangement honors my father's true intentions while ensuring my mother is comfortable for the rest of her life. An allowance, like a child receiving pocket money. The house that had ceased to feel like home the moment they had forced me out. The cabin that represented the last place Edward and I had been truly ourselves. All to be handed over in exchange for a monthly stipend doled out at my son's discretion. Judge Belmont looked to me. Mrs. Collins, your thoughts on this proposal? I took a moment to steady my voice. My husband left clear instructions about his wishes. I intend to honor them. This isn't about money, it's about respecting Edward's decisions and the values he built his company on. Lillian leaned forward, her voice sweet but edged with steel. Mother, think of your grandchildren's future. The Collins legacy should continue through the family line. Surely Edward would want that. Just sign the transfer papers and you can go back to your quiet life without all this unpleasantness. Her words revealed the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of their position. They saw the inheritance as money, property, power. They didn't see it as the responsibility Edward had entrusted to me, not just for wealth, but for his values, his vision of what business could be when conducted with integrity. This isn't about dividing assets or calculating percentages. This is about trust. Edward trusted me to carry forward what mattered to him, not just profits, but people, the employees whose livelihoods depend on the company, the clients who trusted his word, the community that benefited from his success. I won't betray that trust. Marcus's face flushed with anger. So you'll destroy our relationship, tear apart this family, all to control money you don't even know how to manage. This is exactly why Father's decision makes no sense. This is exactly why the court needs to intervene. Judge Belmont observed our exchange, making notes occasionally. After 3 hours of circular arguments and rising tensions, she called a break. In the hallway, Michael expressed cautious optimism. You're holding your ground admirably. They expected you to crumble under pressure or accept a token settlement. Your clarity is throwing them off balance. When we reconvened, Judge Belmont had a different approach. Instead of allowing more argument, she asked direct questions about Edward's state of mind in his final year, his relationship with each of us, specific conversations about inheritance. She was probing for inconsistencies, for indications of either undue influence or long-established intentions. Marcus claimed Edward had promised him leadership of the company since childhood. I countered with specific conversations where Edward had expressed concern about Marcus's business ethics and treatment of employees. Lillian insisted I had prevented family visits during Edward's final months. I produced our shared calendar showing their frequent cancellations. By the session's end, frustration radiated from Marcus and Lillian. They had expected a quick resolution, either my immediate capitulation or a mediator sympathetic to their position. Instead, Judge Belmont had methodically exposed the weaknesses in their narrative while allowing me to demonstrate both competence and principle. As the mediation concluded without resolution, Judge Belmont made one final observation. These cases are rarely just about money or property. They're about recognition, about feelings of value and validation. I encourage all parties to consider what would truly honor the deceased's legacy. Marcus stood abruptly, buttoning his jacket with sharp, angry movements. We'll see what the court has to say. He strode from the room without looking back. Lillian lingered only long enough to deliver a parting shot, her voice low. You're making a terrible mistake. We know things about you, about your past. Things that won't look good when exposed in court. It's not too late to reconsider. The threat hung in the air as she followed Marcus. I remained seated, processing her words. What could they possibly know? My life had been ordinary, dedicated to teaching and to my family. There were no scandals, no secrets that could withstand scrutiny. Michael gathered his papers, his expression troubled. That's typically an empty threat, but we should prepare for character assassination. They'll try to paint you as incompetent, manipulative, possibly even mentally unstable. It will get ugly before it gets better. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of us absorbed in our thoughts. The mediation had clarified one thing. Beyond doubt, there would be no compromise, no peaceful resolution. The battle would play out in court, public and painful. The days before the trial brought escalating pressure. Marcus appeared on local business news discussing his vision for the company's future without directly mentioning the inheritance dispute. The subtext was clear. He was positioning himself as the natural successor, the rightful heir, temporarily delayed by legal technicalities. Lillian's threat materialized in the form of whispers that grew increasingly personal. Former colleagues received calls inquiring about my teaching record, suggesting vague concerns about my classroom behavior. Neighbors were asked about Edward's and my marriage, with insinuations of tensions no one had actually witnessed. The strategy was clear: create doubt about my character, my stability, my worthiness to carry Edward's legacy. Most disturbing was the package that arrived without return address. Inside were printouts of old medical records, my treatment for anxiety following a miscarriage 30 years ago, a brief course of antidepressants after my mother's death. Private pain made public weaponized to suggest ongoing mental fragility. Michael was furious when I showed him. This crosses ethical and possibly legal lines. Medical records are protected. Someone broke privacy laws to get these. The invasion felt more violating than the theft of objects could have been. These were my vulnerabilities, my moments of human struggle, never hidden, but never paraded. That Marcus, my own son, who had witnessed some of these difficult periods, would use them against me revealed how completely he had transformed into a stranger. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the cabin porch, wrapped in one of Edward's old sweaters, despite the mild evening. The lake stretched dark and still before me, reflecting stars like scattered diamonds. I tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring, how it would feel to sit in that courtroom while my life was dissected, my worth questioned. A text message lit up my phone, a number I didn't recognize. Opening it revealed a single sentence: "Your husband knew what his son truly was." Nothing more, no signature. I showed it to Michael the next morning. He advised caution. Could be a supporter, could be another attempt to unsettle you before the hearing. Either way, stay focused on what we know, not mysterious messages. The courthouse steps teemed with people when we arrived, not just family and friends, but strangers drawn by the local news coverage of the Collins inheritance battle. I kept my eyes forward, spine straight, moving through the crowd with as much dignity as I could muster. Inside the courtroom waited all polished wood and hushed anticipation. I settled at the defense table beside Michael, arranging my navy skirt, carefully placing my hands in my lap to hide their slight tremor. The green teacup remained at the cabin, too fragile to risk in transit, but I carried its strength with me, the memory of Edward's trust, a talisman against fear. Marcus and his legal team entered with the choreographed precision of actors taking the stage. His attorney, Hamilton Reed, was known for aggressive litigation strategies and theatrical courtroom performances. The reputation seemed well-deserved as he arranged his materials with flourishing gestures, smiling confidently at the judge's bench. Judge Winters entered, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with a reputation for impatience with legal gamesmanship. She called the court to order with brisk efficiency and outlined the parameters of the hearing. This was not yet the full trial, but a preliminary hearing to determine if there were sufficient grounds to challenge the will's validity. Reed rose, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with practiced nonchalance. Your Honor, this case centers on a fundamental question of justice and intent. Did Edward Collins, in his final months, truly intend to disinherit his only son from meaningful control of the company he built? Or was he influenced his judgment, compromised his true wishes, distorted? He paced before the bench, his voice modulating for maximum dramatic effect. Edward Collins built a legacy intended for continuation through generations, yet his final will, executed when his health was declining, inexplicably redirects that legacy away from his son, the natural heir, the business successor he had trained, and places it entirely in the hands of a woman with no business experience, no management training, no capacity to steward such significant assets. The characterization stung despite my preparation. In Reed's framing, I was not a partner of 40 years, but an interloper, not a trusted confidant, but an opportunistic manipulator. We intend to demonstrate that Mrs. Collins exercised undue influence over her husband during a period of vulnerability, isolating him from family, redirecting his intentions, and ultimately securing an inheritance that defies both logic and Mr. Collins's lifelong plans for his legacy. Reed returned to his seat with a satisfied smile, confident he had set the stage for their narrative. Michael rose next, his approach a stark contrast. No theatrics, no pacing, just calm, measured reason. Your Honor, this case does indeed center on Edward Collins's intentions, but those intentions were not mysterious or manipulated. They were clearly expressed, legally documented, and rooted in Mr. Collins's deep understanding of both his business and his family. Michael placed a document on the evidence table. This medical evaluation, conducted just months before Mr. Collins's death, confirms what everyone who knew him observed. He was mentally sharp, decisionally capable, and fully aware of his choices, until the very end. He proceeded methodically outlining Edward's estate planning process, the consultations with multiple advisors, the careful consideration that went into each decision. Unlike Reed's emotional appeals, Michael built a foundation of facts, each supporting the next, like stones in a wall. Mr. Collins didn't make this decision in haste or confusion. He made it with clear eyes after witnessing concerning patterns of behavior from his son, behavior that made him question whether Marcus Collins would preserve or dismantle the company culture he had spent decades building. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes fixed on the table before him. This direct challenge to his character had clearly not been part of his anticipated script. The judge interjected with her first question, directed at Reed. Counselor, what specific evidence do you have of undue influence beyond the fact that you believe the distribution seems unfair to your client? Reed fumbled momentarily before recovering. We have witness testimony, Your Honor, from household staff who observed Mrs. Collins controlling access to her husband, screening his calls, monitoring his conversations. Judge Winters's eyebrow raised skeptically. Names, specific incidents, contemporaneous documentation. Reed promised such details would emerge during testimony, but the judge's expression suggested she found the response inadequate. She turned to Michael. Counselor, does your client intend to maintain control of Collins' logistics personally, or is there a succession plan? Michael had prepared me for this line of questioning. We had discussed how to balance honoring Edward's trust while acknowledging my limitations. Mrs. Collins has already engaged with the existing executive team, Your Honor. She has no intention of disrupting operations or making uninformed decisions. She views her role as a steward of her husband's values and vision, ensuring the company continues to operate with the integrity that was Mr. Collins's hallmark. The questioning continued for hours, a methodical examination of claims and counterclaims. Reed called their first witness, Emma Barton, who had worked as a housekeeper in our home for the past 5 years. She testified nervously, eyes darting between Marcus and me. Mrs. Collins would check all the mail before Mr. Collins saw it. She would sometimes say he was resting when he wasn't. Once I heard her tell Mr. Collins that Marcus had canceled a lunch when I had answered the phone myself and knew Mr. Collins wasn't available that day. On cross-examination, Michael gently but firmly established that Emma had recently received a generous bonus from Marcus, that her observations had never been documented in any contemporaneous notes, and that many of the behaviors she described were consistent with a wife managing her husband's schedule during periods of illness. Did you ever hear Mrs. Collins threaten Mr. Collins, demand changes to his will, prevent Marcus from seeing his father when Mr. Collins himself wanted the visit? Emma's response was telling. Well, no, not exactly. But there were feelings. You could tell she was controlling things. Feelings, not facts, not actions, just impressions shaped by hindsight and perhaps financial incentive. The afternoon brought the moment I had been dreading. Reed called Marcus to the stand. My son took the oath with solemn precision, then seated himself with the confident posture of someone certain of his righteousness. Reed led him through a carefully constructed narrative, his childhood learning the business at his father's knee, Edward's supposed promises about succession, the shock of discovering he had been disinherited. My father told me repeatedly that the company would be mine someday. All this will be yours to lead when I'm gone, he would say. We had discussed transition plans. I had structured my entire career around eventually taking the helm. Then suddenly, in his final months, everything changed. He became distant, suspicious. My mother was always there, always hovering, always whispering to him when I left the room. The portrait he painted bore no resemblance to reality as I had lived it. Edward had indeed included Marcus in the business from an early age, but the promises Marcus described had never been unconditional. They had always been predicated on Marcus demonstrating the values and judgment necessary to lead. Reed guided Marcus through emotional testimony about being denied access to his father, about discovering the changed will only after Edward's death, about the devastating betrayal of learning his mother had taken everything. By the time he concluded, several jurors were nodding sympathetically. When Michael rose for cross-examination, his approach shifted from the methodical presentation of facts to something more pointed. Mr. Collins, you testified that your father promised you leadership of the company. Did he ever put that promise in writing? Marcus shifted in his seat. Not formally, no. It was understood. Understood by whom? Did your father ever tell shareholders, board members, or employees that you would definitely succeed him? He would introduce me as the future of the company. People knew. Michael walked to the evidence table and lifted a folder. I'd like to introduce Exhibit 14, Your Honor. These are emails from Marcus Collins to his father dated approximately 6 months before Edward Collins's death. Marcus's face drained of color as Michael began reading. If you don't transfer controlling shares to me by the end of the quarter, I will find another way to take what's mine. I'm tired of waiting for you to recognize reality. Either you start the transition now, or I'll be forced to consider other options. The courtroom fell silent. The threatening tone of the email contrasted sharply with the dutiful son Marcus had portrayed himself to be. Michael continued, relentless now. Would you characterize this as the tone a son typically takes with a father he respects? Does this sound like someone patiently waiting for a promised inheritance, or someone demanding what he believes he's entitled to, regardless of his father's wishes? Marcus's composure cracked. You're taking that out of context. Dad was being stubborn, refusing to see that changes were necessary. The company needed new leadership, modern approaches. He was stuck in the past. And these modern approaches, they included the workforce reduction proposal your father rejected. The one that would have eliminated nearly a third of the company's longest-serving employees. By the time Michael finished his cross-examination, Marcus's carefully constructed image had unraveled. In its place stood a man driven by entitlement rather than respect, by ambition rather than love, willing to threaten his own father to get what he wanted. The day's final bombshell came when Michael announced our next evidence. Your Honor, we would like to play video testimony recorded by Edward Collins specifically addressing his estate decisions. Reed objected immediately, arguing that the video might be edited or created under duress. Judge Winters overruled him after reviewing documentation of when and how the video had been made. The courtroom lights dimmed. On the large screen mounted on the wall, Edward appeared seated in his office chair, the familiar bookshelves behind him, the family photos on his desk, including one of Marcus as a child that seemed particularly poignant now. Edward looked directly into the camera, his gaze unwavering. I'm recording this statement of my own free will with a clear mind and without any coercion. If you're seeing this, it means my will is being challenged, likely by my son Marcus. He paused, sadness etching deeper lines around his eyes. I love my son. I always will. But love doesn't blind me to what he's become. Over the past 5 years, I've watched him prioritize profit over people's status, over substance power, over principle. I've tried to guide him back to the values this company was built on: integrity, loyalty, community. He has rejected those lessons repeatedly. Edward shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly. I leave my estate to my wife Sophia, not as a punishment to Marcus, but as protection for everything I've built and everyone who depends on it. Sophia understands that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. She will protect the company culture, the jobs, the ethical standards I've tried to maintain. His voice softened, and he seemed to look directly at me through the screen. Sophia has been my foundation for 40 years. When I had nothing, she believed in me. When I faltered, she steadied me. When success came, she reminded me of what truly mattered. Every decision that built this company, we made together. Sometimes at the kitchen table, sometimes on the dock at our cabin, sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn. Her name may not be on the organizational chart, but her wisdom is embedded in every sound choice I've made. The video continued for nearly 10 minutes. Edward outlined specific instances of Marcus's concerning behavior: pressure to cut corners on safety regulations, arguments about employee benefits, disrespect toward long-serving staff. He detailed his decision-making process, the consultations with advisors, the careful consideration that went into his estate plan. When the video ended and the lights came back up, I realized I was crying silently, tears tracking down my cheeks unchecked. Edward's voice, his presence, his absolute certainty, they filled the courtroom like a physical force. For a moment, it felt as though he were truly there, standing beside me against the storm. I glanced at Marcus. His face had hardened into a masked jaw clenched tight. Beside him, Lillian whispered urgently, her hand on his arm. The narrative they had so carefully constructed lay in ruins around them, demolished by Edward's own words. Judge Winters called a recess until the following morning. As people filed out, whispers rippled through the courtroom. The tide of public opinion so recently aligned against me had begun to shift. Edward's testimony had transformed me from suspected manipulator to trusted partner, from opportunistic widow to rightful heir. In the hallway, Michael allowed himself a small smile. That went better than expected. Edward's video testimony was even more powerful than I anticipated. He didn't just explain his decisions, he told a love story, a partnership story. That resonates with people in a way legal arguments never could. I nodded, still processing the emotional impact of seeing Edward, hearing his voice, feeling his support reach across the divide between life and death. In that moment, despite the battle still ahead, despite the pain of Marcus's betrayal, I felt a glimmer of something I had almost forgotten: hope. The second day of trial brought Lillian to the witness stand. Where Marcus had projected righteous indignation, Lillian opted for tearful vulnerability. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief as she described her concerns about my isolation of Edward, my refusal to include them in medical decisions, my erratic behavior following Edward's death. I was just trying to help, to be a supportive daughter-in-law, but Mrs. Collins pushed us away at every turn. She wouldn't let us help with Edward's care. She wouldn't discuss his condition honestly with us. And after he passed, she became so strange, hiding away at the cabin, refusing to discuss practical matters, acting as though we were enemies rather than family. Her performance was masterful. The concerned relative, the voice of reason, the woman simply trying to hold a family together against irrational resistance. Only those who knew her well would notice the calculated precision behind each tear, each trembling word. Michael's cross-examination was devastating in its simplicity. Mrs. Collins, you testified that my client prevented you from helping with Edward's care. Can you provide specific dates when you offered assistance and were refused? Lillian faltered. Well, it was an ongoing situation. Many times. Any specific examples documented offers of help, text messages, emails. Each question exposed the emptiness behind her claims. No, she couldn't provide specifics. No, she hadn't documented these supposed incidents. No, she couldn't explain why their own text messages to Edward often canceled planned visits rather than requesting more time with him. By the time Michael finished, Lillian's credibility had crumbled. Her testimony, designed to paint me as irrational and controlling, had instead revealed her own willingness to fabricate narrative without factual foundation. The final witness of the day was Jonathan Hale, Edward's oldest friend and business partner. Unlike the emotional testimonies that preceded his, Jonathan spoke with straightforward clarity about the company's history, about Edward's management philosophy, and about the growing tensions with Marcus over business direction. Edward built this company on relationships, with employees, with clients, with the community. He believed business could be profitable without being predatory. Marcus fundamentally disagreed. He viewed Edward's approach as outdated, inefficient. Their conflicts weren't just about succession, they were about values. Jonathan described specific meetings where Marcus had pushed for aggressive cost-cutting measures, offshoring jobs, reducing quality controls. He detailed Edward's growing concern that Marcus would dismantle everything he had built the moment he gained control. Edward changed his will after Marcus tried to force through a restructuring plan that would have eliminated benefits for our longest-serving employees, people who had been with us from the beginning, who had sacrificed alongside us during the lean years. Edward blocked it, and Marcus threatened legal action against his own father. That was the breaking point. With each testimony, each piece of evidence, the true picture emerged more clearly. This wasn't a story about a manipulative wife taking advantage of a declining husband. It was a story about a principled businessman making a difficult choice to protect his legacy from his own son's divergent values. As the day's proceedings ended, Judge Winters addressed both legal teams. "I've heard enough witness testimony. Tomorrow I'll hear closing arguments, and then I'll make my ruling on whether this challenge can proceed to full trial." That evening, back at the cabin, I sat on the porch watching twilight settle over the lake. The past 2 days had been exhausting emotionally and physically. Having my character questioned my motives, scrutinized my private pain exposed, each had taken its toll. Yet beneath the exhaustion ran a current of fierce determination. Edward had trusted me to carry his legacy forward. I would not falter now. Michael called with updates on procedural matters and predictions about the judge's likely ruling. His confidence was cautious but growing. The evidence is overwhelmingly in our favor. Edward's video testimony was particularly compelling. You could see its impact on everyone in that courtroom. I think we've demonstrated that his decisions were made with full capacity and clear intent. After we ended the call, I made tea in the green porcelain cup, cradling it between my palms as I had so many times before. The familiar weight, the slight chip near the handle, the delicate pattern, all connected me to Edward, to our shared past, to the trust that bound us even now. The trial's final day dawned clear and cold, the lake mist burning away under bright autumn sunlight. I dressed with particular care, not in morning black, but in a deep blue dress Edward had always loved. Not armor, but affirmation. The courtroom was more crowded than previous days, word having spread about the dramatic testimony and Edward's video statement. I felt the weight of stares as I walked to the defense table, but kept my eyes forward, my posture straight. Whatever judgment came, I would face it with dignity. Reed delivered a closing argument that attempted to reframe the evidence within their narrative. He spoke of natural succession being unnaturally interrupted, of a mother's jealousy, of her son's relationship with his father, of an elderly man's confusion exploited by a manipulative spouse. His words were passionate but rang hollow against the weight of evidence presented. Michael's closing was characteristically measured, focusing on documented facts rather than emotional appeals. He reminded the court of Edward's medical evaluation, confirming his mental capacity, of the video testimony, explaining his reasoning, of the threatening emails from Marcus that revealed the true nature of their relationship. This case asks us to determine whose voice matters most in deciding Edward Collins's legacy. Is it his son who believed himself entitled to inherit regardless of his actions or values? Is it this court substituting its judgment for that of a man who planned carefully and spoke clearly? Or is it Edward Collins himself who made his wishes known through proper legal channels, who explained his reasoning on video, who trusted his life partner to honor what mattered most to him? As Michael concluded, a hush fell over the courtroom. All eyes turned to Judge Winters, who sat thoughtfully for several long moments before speaking. I have presided over many contested will cases during my career. Most involve genuine questions of intent or capacity. This case does not. The evidence clearly establishes that Edward Collins was of sound mind when he executed his will, that he had specific and rational reasons for his decisions, and that those decisions were made without undue influence. She looked directly at Marcus, her expression stern. What I see before me is not a widow manipulating her husband, but a widow defending the legacy he deliberately placed in her hands. What I see are heirs who confuse entitlement with love, who believe money is proof of devotion. That belief is false. The courtroom remained utterly silent as she continued. This court finds the will valid. The estate of Edward Collins in full belongs to his lawful heir, Mrs. Sophia Collins. The gavel struck with a resounding crack that seemed to echo through every bone in my body. It was finished. I had won. Not just legally, but morally. Edward's wishes would be honored. His legacy would be protected. I did not feel the swell of triumph I thought might come. Instead, my hands trembled against each other, my breath unsteady. It was not victory I felt, but grief renewed. The grief of realizing I had lost my son long before this trial began. The paper may have been signed today, but the fracture had started years ago, in choices he made in words he had thrown like stones in the slow erosion of trust. Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Without a word, he strode from the courtroom, Lillian following close behind. They did not look back, did not acknowledge me. Only the sharp click of their heels on the marble floor marked their exit. Michael gathered his papers, satisfaction evident in his movements despite his professional restraint. "Congratulations, Sophia. Justice was served today." I nodded, unable to form words around the complex emotions swirling within me. Yes, justice had been served. Edward's wishes would be honored. But at what cost? A family irreparably broken, a son lost not to death but to greed, a future that would unfold without the healing power of reconciliation. As we left the courthouse, reporters waited on the steps, eager for statements about the Collins inheritance battle. Michael fielded their questions with diplomatic brevity, while I stood silently beside him, my mind already turning toward what came next. The legal victory was only the beginning. Now I faced an even greater challenge, honoring Edward's trust by becoming the steward he believed I could be. In the car returning to the cabin, Michael outlined next steps, transferring accounts, updating corporate records, meeting with the executive team, the practical matters that would transform legal victory into functional reality. But beneath these logistics lay deeper questions I alone could answer. What kind of leader would I be? How would I preserve Edward's values while adapting to changing times? What legacy would I build upon the foundation he had left me? The cabin came into view, its simple structure solid against the backdrop of pines and lake. No longer just a refuge from the storm, it now represented possibility, a place to begin again, to reimagine what came next. I thanked Michael for everything and watched his car disappear down the gravel road. Alone on the porch, I lifted my face to the afternoon sun. The battle was won, but the journey was just beginning. Edward had believed I was strong enough, wise enough, determined enough. Now I needed to believe it too. The judge's gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. "This court finds the will valid," he declared. "The estate of Edward Collins belongs to his lawful heir, Mrs. Sophia Collins." I had won the case, but as I watched my son storm out without a word, I knew I had lost something that could never be replaced by any fortune. Michael gathered his papers, tucking them neatly into his briefcase with methodical precision. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators filing out with hushed whispers and curious glances. A few people approached with congratulations or supportive words, but their voices seemed distant, as though reaching me through water. "You did it, Sophia. Edward would be proud." I nodded mechanically, my fingers tracing the outline of the green teacup in my purse. The victory felt hollow, tinged with a loss deeper than any legal battle could measure. The son I had raised, the boy who once brought me dandelion bouquets and crawled into my lap during thunderstorms, was now a stranger striding away without a backward glance. Jonathan approached his tall frame, casting a shadow across the defense table. His weathered face carried a mix of satisfaction and sorrow that mirrored my own conflicted emotions. "We protected what Edward built. That's what matters most right now." Sheriff Cole tipped his hat as he passed his quiet nod, conveying respect without intruding on my complicated moment. These men, Edward's allies who had become mine, formed a protective circle as we navigated the courthouse steps, shielding me from the reporters thrusting microphones and shouting questions about the Collins family feud. The drive back to the cabin stretched longer than the miles warranted, each bend in the road, giving me time to process what had happened and what lay ahead. The legal victory had secured Edward's wishes, but it had only marked the beginning of my responsibility. $33 million, a multinational company with hundreds of employees, properties, investments, charitable commitments, the weight of it all pressed against my chest, making each breath deliberate. The cabin appeared through the trees, its weathered exterior glowing amber in the late afternoon light. No longer just a refuge from rejection, it now represented something else, a beginning point for whatever came next. I parked and sat motionless behind the wheel, watching shadows lengthen across the gravel driveway. Inside, I moved through familiar motions, lighting the fire, putting on water for tea, wrapping a quilt around my shoulders against the autumn chill. The green porcelain teacup took its place on the small table beside the armchair, its presence both comfort and challenge. I picked it up, turning it to catch the firelight, the chip on its rim, a testament to survival through imperfection. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to speak aloud to the empty room, to the memory that seemed to linger in every corner. What now, Edward? You trusted me with all of this. You believed I could carry it forward, but I'm a teacher, not a CEO. I know literature and grammar, not logistics and corporate governance. What did you see in me that I can't yet see in myself? The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. No answer came, of course, but the act of voicing my doubts somehow made them less overwhelming. Edward had never made impulsive decisions. If he believed I could handle this responsibility, he must have had reasons beyond blind faith or convenient choice. The next morning brought a new purpose. I would not hide in the cabin nursing wounds or doubts. I would step into the role Edward had entrusted to me, beginning with understanding exactly what that entailed. I called Michael and arranged a meeting at the Collins Logistics headquarters, a place I had visited for company functions but never with any official capacity. The corporate offices occupied 3 floors of a glass and steel building downtown. The security guard's eyes widened slightly when I gave my name, news of the court decision having clearly reached every corner of the company. He escorted me to the executive elevator with careful deference, the first tangible sign of my changed status. Jonathan met me in the reception area, his familiar presence easing my entry into this unfamiliar territory. The executive floor hummed with activity, phones, ringing keyboards, clicking conversations, pausing briefly as I passed. Jonathan guided me to what had been Edward's office, a spacious corner room with views of the river and mountains beyond. I hesitated at the threshold. The space still carried Edward's presence, his collection of first edition adventure novels lining one wall, the antique globe he'd restored himself, the family photos arranged precisely on his desk. Entering felt like both intrusion and inheritance. It's your office now, Sophia, however you want to use it. The desk chair, Edward's chair, awaited me. I sat down slowly, feeling its unfamiliar contours adjust to support me. The perspective from this position was new, the view of the river different from this height, this angle, a metaphor for everything changing around me while remaining fundamentally the same. Throughout the morning, Jonathan introduced me to key personnel department heads, financial advisors, the executive team that had worked closely with Edward. They approached with varying degrees of curiosity and caution, unsure what changes might come with new leadership. I recognized many faces from company events over the years, but meeting them now as owner rather than spouse shifted the dynamic in subtle ways. The CFO, a trim woman named Ellen Reardon, presented a comprehensive overview of the company's financial position. Her initial wariness gave way to guarded approval as I asked questions that revealed I wasn't completely ignorant of business fundamentals. Managing household finances for decades had taught me more than Marcus ever recognized. Ellen's fingers flew across her tablet, bringing up charts and projections on the conference room screen. Collins Logistics is financially solid, Mrs. Collins. Your husband built a company with remarkably little debt, strong cash reserves, and loyal clients. The quarterly projections show continued growth in our main service sectors. She hesitated, glancing at Jonathan before continuing. There are some challenging decisions on the horizon, expansion opportunities in the Southwest that require significant investment, technology upgrades that can't be delayed much longer, and, of course, the employee retention package your husband was developing before his passing. Each item represented not just business decisions, but values choices: how to grow without sacrificing quality, how to modernize without losing the human connection. Edward had prioritized how to reward loyalty in a market that increasingly treated workers as disposable assets. The complexity was daunting, but not paralyzing. I'll need detailed briefings on each of these issues. I want to understand the options, the implications before making any decisions. Ellen nodded, a new respect evident in her expression. I may have been a newcomer to corporate leadership, but my approach, careful consideration rather than impulsive action, resonated with Edward's management style. Perhaps that was one reason he had trusted me to continue his work. The afternoon brought meetings with the legal team about transferring ownership of various properties and accounts. By the time I left the building, my head swam with information terms and responsibilities I had never anticipated. I carried a briefcase filled with documents requiring review and decisions demanding attention. Back at the cabin, I spread the papers across the dining table, creating categories for immediate action, further research, and long-term planning. The task was overwhelming, viewed as a whole, but manageable when broken down into components. Edward's methodical approach to problems had rubbed off on me over 40 years of marriage. The next weeks fell into a rhythm: mornings at the company offices, learning systems and processes, meeting employees at all levels; afternoons reviewing documents and consulting with advisors; evenings researching business concepts that had previously seemed irrelevant to my life. I subscribed to business journals, enrolled in online courses about corporate governance, studied the history of similar companies and their leadership transitions. Sleep came easier than expected, my mind and body exhausted by the steep learning curve. Dreams often featured Edward not as the dying man in the hospital bed, but as the vibrant partner of our prime years, walking beside me through challenges, his hand steady at my back. I would wake with fragments of dream conversations, lingering insights that seemed to come from him, but perhaps emerged from my own deepening understanding. A month after the trial, I received an unexpected letter forwarded from our old address. The envelope bore no return address, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single page and a small key. Mrs. Collins, I served as your husband's personal assistant for the last 5 years. He asked me to wait 1 month after any legal matters were settled before sending you this key. It opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank box number 247. He said you would understand its significance when the time came. With respect, James Morley. The name was familiar. A young man Edward had mentioned occasionally, someone he had hired despite limited experience because he saw potential worth developing. The key was small, unremarkable, except for the number etched into its surface, 247. The bank manager led me to a private room after verifying my identification. The safety deposit box yielded a sealed envelope with my name written in Edward's distinctive hand and a second smaller box. I opened the envelope first, hands trembling slightly. My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I'm gone, and you've successfully defended what I entrusted to you. I never doubted you would. I've left you an enormous responsibility, one you never asked for or expected. You might be wondering why I believed you could handle it. The answer is simple. I've watched you handle everything life has thrown at us for 40 years with grace, intelligence, and unwavering integrity. Remember when we nearly lost everything in '93? The warehouse fire, the insurance battle, the months of wondering if we could make payroll. You were the one who found the accounting discrepancy that saved us. You were the one who suggested the bridge loan that kept us afloat. You were always my silent partner, my most trusted advisor, even when others saw only Edward's wife. The company needs your perspective now more than ever. The market's push for faster growth, bigger profits, regardless of human cost. Marcus embraced that mindset, but you never have. You understand that business isn't just numbers, it's people, relationships, trust built over time. In the small box, you'll find something I've kept hidden even from you. It's time for it to see daylight again. All my love for all time, Edward. Inside the smaller box lay a second letter, this one yellowed with age and a faded photograph. The image showed a much younger Edward and me standing with a group of people outside a small warehouse, the original Collins Logistics building, barely more than a storage shed with a hand-painted sign. We all wore matching t-shirts with the company logo arms, linked faces bright with hope, despite the uncertainty of those early days. The letter was dated 25 years earlier, written in Edward's hand, but never sent. To my partners at Collins Logistics, as we celebrate our 5th year in business, I want to formally acknowledge what many of you already know. This company exists because of my wife, Sophia. The startup money came from her inheritance after her father's passing. The first logo was her design. The name Collins Logistics was her suggestion when I was ready to give up after 3 failed attempts. Most importantly, the values that guide our business integrity, loyalty, community come from her. When I've been tempted to cut corners or prioritize growth over people, she has been my conscience, my compass. I'm establishing this letter as formal recognition that while my name may be on the company, Sophia Collins is, and always has been, an equal founder and partner in everything we've built together. With gratitude, Edward Collins. The letter had never been sent, never been formalized. Edward had tucked it away, perhaps waiting for the right moment that never seemed to come. But he had kept it, preserved it, and now ensured it would reach me when I most needed its affirmation. I sat in that private bank room, holding physical proof of what Edward had always told me privately, that our success had been built together, that my contributions mattered, that he saw me as an equal partner even when the world did not. The knowledge settled into me like a foundation stone, something solid to build upon. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I placed the photograph and letter on the mantel beside the green teacup. 3 talismans of the past to guide my future, tangible reminders of why Edward had trusted me with his legacy and why I could trust myself to carry it forward. The next morning, I called a meeting of the executive team. They gathered in the conference room, curiosity evident in their expressions. For the past month, I had primarily observed, learned, asked questions. Now it was time to lead. I've spent these weeks listening and learning about the company my husband built, the company we built together. I know many of you have been wondering about my plans, about the direction we'll take moving forward. Today, I want to share my vision. The tension in the room was palpable. These people had weathered uncertainty since Edward's death, followed by the public spectacle of the will contest. They had legitimate concerns about their futures, about whether I would sell the company or make dramatic changes. Collins Logistics was founded on 3 principles: integrity in all dealings, loyalty to our people, and commitment to the communities we serve. Those principles will not change under my leadership. What will evolve is how we express them in a changing market. I outlined my initial priorities, implementing the employee retention program Edward had been developing, investing in the technology upgrades needed to remain competitive, and exploring the Southwest expansion with careful attention to maintaining company culture through growth. Not revolutionary changes, but clear direction that honored Edward's vision while acknowledging new realities. As the meeting progressed, I watched shoulders relax and nods of approval increase. These people had loved and respected Edward. They had feared Marcus's approach would dismantle what they valued about their workplace. In me, they were finding reassurance that the company's soul would remain intact even as its operations evolved. That afternoon, I visited the warehouse facilities where Edward had started his career in logistics. The massive space hummed with activity, forklifts moving pallets, workers scanning packages, trucks being loaded and unloaded with precise coordination. I had been here for company picnics and anniversary celebrations, but never to truly understand the operation. The floor manager, a burly man named Frank, who had been with the company for 20 years, guided me through the complex choreography of modern logistics. His initial formality gradually gave way to genuine enthusiasm as he explained innovations he had implemented, challenges they faced, and possibilities for improvement. Mrs. Collins, if you don't mind me saying, you ask different questions than your husband did. He focused on efficiency metrics, throughput, quantifiable outcomes. You're asking about worker safety, shift, rotation, fatigue, communication between departments. It's refreshing. His observation crystallized something I had been sensing throughout my immersion in the business. Edward had built an excellent company with strong values, but his perspective had necessarily been shaped by his position, his training, his gender, his generation. I brought a different lens, not better or worse, but complementary. Perhaps that complementary perspective was exactly what Edward had recognized was needed for the next chapter. By the 2-month mark after the trial, I had established a working rhythm and clear priorities. The business pages had moved on from the Collins inheritance drama to newer scandals. The employees had adjusted to my leadership style. I had begun to feel, if not completely comfortable, at least not entirely out of place in Edward's chair. Then the envelope arrived. It bore the letterhead of an exclusive rehabilitation facility in Arizona. The contents were simple, a brief note from Marcus requesting a meeting. No apologies, no explanations, just a time and date the following week when he would be at the cabin. The formal, detached tone couldn't disguise the tremor evident in his handwriting. I placed the letter beside the teacup, unsure how to feel. The son who had threatened and belittled me, who had tried to strip away everything Edward had entrusted to me, now wanted a meeting. The timing was suspicious, just as I was finding my footing, establishing my authority. Was this another attempt to undermine me, to destabilize what I was building? Jonathan's advice was blunt when I called him. Be careful, Sophia. Marcus is smart and strategic. If he's reaching out now, he has an angle. Michael's perspective was more measured. You're under no obligation to meet with him. The legal matters are settled. But closure might be valuable for you, regardless of his motives. Sheriff Cole offered to be present, a silent guardian, to ensure the meeting remained civil. I declined, knowing this conversation needed to happen without witnesses, without buffers between mother and son. The appointed day arrived, crisp and clear, autumn, painting the trees around the cabin in fiery hues. I spent the morning on the dock watching light play across the lake surface, rehearsing what I might say, preparing for whatever agenda Marcus might bring. By noon, I felt centered enough to return to the cabin and wait. His car appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, the expensive engine purring softly as it came to a stop in the gravel driveway. Marcus emerged alone. No Lillian, no lawyers, no entourage. He wore casual clothes rather than his usual corporate armor, and something in his posture seemed different, less rigid with self-importance. I opened the door before he could knock, standing in the threshold, neither inviting him in nor blocking his entry, a neutral position for an uncertain reunion. Mother, thank you for agreeing to see me. His voice lacked the sharp edge I had grown accustomed to hearing. He seemed thinner, his face more lined than I remembered from the courtroom 2 months earlier. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter without verbally welcoming him. Marcus moved into the main room, his eyes taking in the changes I had made to the cabin, the dining table, now covered with company reports, the bookshelves holding business texts, alongside Edward's fiction collection, the photograph from the safety deposit box prominently displayed on the mantel. He paused at the sight of it, recognition flickering across his features. I remember when that was taken. I was 7. Dad brought me to the company picnic, let me hand out the t-shirts. The memory surprised me. I had forgotten his presence that day, how excited he had been to participate in grown-up business. A reminder that before he became the adversary across a courtroom, he had been a little boy, proud of his father, eager to belong. I gestured toward the armchair by the fire, taking the rocker opposite. Neither of us spoke immediately, the crackle of flames filling the space between us. Eventually, Marcus broke the silence. I've been in treatment 30 days so far for anger management and other issues. The facility director thought it was time for me to begin making amends. His words explained his appearance, the subtle changes in his demeanor. They did not, however, explain why he had chosen to start with me, the person he had most publicly and viciously attacked. Lillian left. Right after the trial, said she'd married someone destined for power and wealth, not a man who lost everything to his mother. No hint of irony colored his voice, no recognition of how his wife's mercenary calculation mirrored his own approach to inheritance. I kept my expression neutral, neither sympathizing nor gloating. His marital problems were not my concern, and I suspected they were not the real purpose of this visit. Marcus stared into the fire fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest. The rehabilitation center says I need to acknowledge my actions and their impact. So here it is, I was wrong. About Dad, about you, about what I was entitled to. I let greed and ego destroy our family. The admission hung in the air between us, neither fully accepted nor rejected. I had imagined this moment during sleepless nights, my son acknowledging his wrongs, seeking forgiveness. The reality felt both less and more than the fantasy. His words seemed rehearsed, part of a treatment protocol, yet vulnerability showed through the cracks in his practiced delivery. Why are you really here, Marcus? Is this just a box to check for your recovery program, or do you actually want something from me? My directness startled him. The old Marcus would have bristled, launched a counterattack. This version looked down at his hands, a flush spreading across his cheekbones. I've been reading about the company. The quarterly report was published last week. You're implementing Dad's employee retention program, going ahead with the technology upgrades, even exploring the Southwest expansion, but with a modified approach that preserves jobs at the original locations. You're doing everything he would have done, but with your own twist. He was right to trust you. The admission clearly cost him each word extracted painfully from his pride. I remained silent, waiting for him to reach his actual purpose. Marcus had never been one for reflection without agenda. I want to come back, not as CEO or heir apparent, just somewhere I can learn the business the right way this time, from the ground up if necessary. There it was, the request beneath the apology. Not forgiveness for its own sake, but redemption with practical benefit. Typical Marcus, even in supposed humility. Yet something in his demeanor suggested the request wasn't entirely calculating. The rehabilitation program had perhaps cracked open something genuine, a recognition of what he had lost beyond money and power. I studied my son's face, searching for the boy who had once sat at this very cabin with Edward, learning to fish, building model airplanes, absorbing values I had thought were taking root. Where had that child gone? Was anything of him salvageable beneath the man who had called me incompetent, who had tried to wrest away Edward's trust, who had weaponized my private pain in court? That's not a decision I can make today, Marcus. Trust once broken isn't repaired with a single conversation. If you're serious about learning the business properly, about honoring your father's values rather than just acquiring his position, you'll need to demonstrate that commitment over time. Disappointment flashed across his features, quickly controlled. He had expected immediate resolution, either complete rejection or instant forgiveness. Neither was forthcoming. What would it take? To prove I'm serious. I rose and moved to the mantel, picking up the green porcelain teacup that had become my talisman through all the turmoil. Its weight in my hand centered me as I considered his question. Start at the beginning. The way your father did. Apply for an entry-level position using your qualifications, not your name. Work without special treatment or expectations. Learn the business from the perspective of those who actually move the packages, track the shipments, serve the customers. Show that you value people beyond what they can do for you. Demonstrate integrity even when it costs you something. That might be a beginning. Marcus stared at me as though seeing someone unfamiliar. Perhaps he was. The mother he had dismissed as weak, as merely an extension of Edward, as easily intimidated and manipulated, had vanished. In her place stood someone who had weathered his worst attacks and emerged stronger, someone who now held the power he had coveted and was using it according to her own judgment. I'll do it, however long it takes. His voice carried determination, but also uncertainty, as though he himself didn't know if he was capable of the humility and patience such a path would require. I nodded, neither encouraging nor discouraging. The choice and the work would be his alone. Our conversation continued for another hour, covering neutral topics, mostly his treatment program, my adjustments to corporate leadership, memories of Edward that we could share without reopening wounds. When he finally rose to leave, the atmosphere between us had shifted from hostile strangers to cautious acquaintances. Not mother and son, not yet, perhaps not ever again in the way we had been, but no longer adversaries intent on the other's defeat. After Marcus left, I stood on the porch watching his car disappear down the winding road. The encounter had drained me emotionally, stirring hopes I had thought safely buried alongside rage I had believed resolved. The complexity of family, how it could damage and heal, constrain and liberate, wound and nourish all within the same relationships, weighed heavily as twilight gathered around the cabin. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Barbara, my former teaching colleague, who had been one of the first to warn me about the rumors Marcus had spread. "Sophia, the most extraordinary thing has happened. The high school received an anonymous donation specifically for the English department, $5 million. It's earmarked for a new library wing, writing lab, literacy programs for at-risk students, everything we always dreamed of but could never fund. The donor requested only one thing: that the new facilities be named the Edward and Sophia Collins Learning Center." The news stunned me. I had been considering establishing some kind of educational foundation or scholarship fund in Edward's memory, but had not yet taken concrete steps. Someone had anticipated my intentions and acted on them, someone who knew both Edward and me well enough to understand what would matter to us. Jonathan denied involvement when I called him, though his voice carried a suspicious note of satisfaction. Michael claimed attorney-client privilege when I pressed him. Sheriff Cole just chuckled and said, "Sometimes justice takes surprising forms." The mystery donor remained anonymous, but the impact was immediate and profound. The town that had been divided by gossip and speculation during the will contest now buzzed with excitement about the educational opportunities the donation would create. My reputation shifted from greedy widow to generous benefactor virtually overnight, though I had done nothing to earn either label. By the 3-month mark after the trial, I had settled into a rhythm that balanced corporate responsibilities with personal renewal. 3 days a week at headquarters, working closely with department heads, learning systems, making carefully considered decisions. 2 days at the cabin, reviewing reports, researching industry trends, and gradually transforming the space into a combination home and satellite office. The hardest part was the evenings, the quiet hours when work was set aside, but sleep hadn't yet claimed me. In those moments, I still reached automatically for Edward, still expected to hear his laugh, still composed thoughts to share with him later. Grief ambushed me in these unguarded times, reminding me that all the legal victories and business successes couldn't fill the space his absence had created. It was during one such evening, staring into the fire, with the teacup cradled between my palms, that the idea first crystallized. I had been reviewing applications for our management training program, noting the predominance of young men from prestigious business schools. Where were the women? The candidates from diverse backgrounds, the applicants who might bring different perspectives to leadership roles. Edward had built a company with good values but limited diversity in its upper ranks, not from deliberate exclusion, but from the patterns typical of his generation and industry. I had an opportunity to expand that vision while maintaining its ethical core. The next morning, I called Ellen Reardon, the CFO, who had become one of my most trusted advisors. By lunchtime, we had sketched the framework for what would become the Edward Collins Scholarship Fund, a program designed to identify promising students from underrepresented backgrounds and support their education in logistics, business management, and related fields. Unlike traditional corporate scholarships that focused solely on academic achievements, this program would value diverse life experiences, problem-solving creativity, and demonstrated character, Recipients would receive not just financial support, but mentorship, internship opportunities, and priority consideration for positions at Collins Logistics upon graduation. When we presented the concept to the board of directors the following week, approval was unanimous. Several members volunteered personal contributions to supplement the corporate funding. The company's legal team began drafting the necessary documentation to establish the fund as a separate nonprofit entity with sustainable governance. As winter settled around the cabin, transforming the lake into a mirror of ice and draping the pines with snow, I found myself drawn more and more to the idea of using the cabin itself as the scholarship program's headquarters. The space held such significance for Edward and me, our refuge, our place of authentic connection, away from corporate pressures and social expectations. What better location to nurture the next generation of business leaders committed to both success and integrity? I consulted architects about tasteful expansions that would preserve the cabin's character while adding necessary meeting spaces and technology infrastructure. The original structure would remain largely untouched, a reminder of origins of foundations of what matters beyond profit margins and market share. The first weekend in December brought unexpected visitors, three former students who had heard about the scholarship program through community grapevine. They arrived bearing homemade bread and questions about how they might contribute to the initiative. One taught economics at the local community college, another worked in college admissions, the third ran a mentoring program for first-generation college students. Each brought expertise and networks that could strengthen the scholarship program's impact. We gathered around the dining table, the business documents temporarily set aside to make room for their ideas and enthusiasm. By evening, what had begun as a casual visit had transformed into an impromptu planning session, complete with flip charts propped against the fireplace and sticky notes marking key concepts and connections. When they finally departed, promising to return the following weekend with more refined proposals, I stood on the porch watching their headlights disappear into the darkness. The cabin felt different afterward, warmer, more purposeful, less a shrine to what was lost and more an incubator for what might yet be created. That night I dreamed of Edward, not the Edward of our final days, weakened by illness, but Edward in his prime, laughing, as he steered our small motorboat across the lake, pointing out eagles nesting in distant pines, his face alive with joy and possibility. In the dream, he turned to me with that particular smile that always preceded his most ambitious ideas. "You're building something new, Chave, something that carries forward what matters most." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before his death. The dream felt like benediction, like permission to transform grief into creation, absence into opportunity. The winter months passed in a blur of activity. The scholarship program took shape, with applications set to open in spring. The cabin renovation plans were finalized with construction scheduled to begin when the weather warmed. The company continued its steady growth under my increasingly confident leadership with quarterly reports showing strong performance despite industry headwinds. Marcus kept his word, applying for an entry-level position in warehouse operations under his mother's maiden name. His supervisor, unaware of his true identity, reported that he worked hard, asked thoughtful questions, and treated coworkers with unexpected respect. Whether the change would prove lasting remained to be seen, but the effort itself represented a kind of victory. As the anniversary of Edward's death approached, I felt a growing need for private ritual for acknowledgement of both loss and continuation. The morning dawned clear and cold, the lake still frozen beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. I wrapped myself in Edward's old parka, tucked the green porcelain teacup carefully into my pocket, and walked the familiar path to the small rise overlooking the water. We had scattered Edward's ashes here in this place he had loved beyond all others. The wind had carried them across the lake's surface, integrating him into the landscape that had restored him throughout life's pressures. Standing there again, I felt his absence and his presence simultaneously, the paradox of grief's evolution. I knelt, brushing snow aside to touch frozen earth. From my pocket, I withdrew the teacup, its green glaze vibrant against the monochrome winter palette. I traced its familiar shape, the slight chip in its rim, the delicate handle that had supported countless moments of reflection. Edward, it's been a year, the hardest and strangest year of my life. I've lost you and found myself. I've been cast out and built a new home. I've been underestimated and discovered strength I never knew I possessed. Through it all, you've been with me, not in person, but in the foundation you built, the trust you extended, the love that continues beyond your physical presence. Wind whispered through pine branches, sending soft puffs of snow drifting downward like gentle responses to my words. I'm using what you gave me, Edward, not just the money or the company, but the confidence, the values, the vision of business as something that can improve lives rather than just generate profits. I'm carrying it forward, but also expanding it, reshaping it for new challenges. I hope you would approve. I placed the teacup gently in the snow, its green, a stark contrast against white crystals. The gesture felt right, not an abandonment of my talisman, but an offering, a symbol of continuity between what was and what would be. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had risen, fully casting long blue shadows across pristine snow. The porch, which had seemed so empty when I first arrived as an exile, now bore signs of new purpose, architectural plans, weighted down with stones, a box of scholarship program brochures, awaiting distribution, boot prints from recent visitors, crisscrossing older paths. Inside, embers from the previous night's fire still glowed in the hearth. I added kindling, watching small flames catch and grow, transforming what had nearly ended into fresh warmth and light. A perfect metaphor for the year past and the years ahead. The first students would arrive in June, 5 scholarship recipients, selected from hundreds of applicants, each bringing unique perspectives and potential to the program. They would stay at the cabin for an intensive summer leadership institute before beginning their formal education. The renovations would be complete by then, the expansion blending seamlessly with the original structure, just as new purpose was integrating with honored memory. I moved to the window overlooking the lake, watching sunlight dance across ice that would, in time, thaw and flow freely again. The cycle of seasons of endings and beginnings, loss and renewal, played out in nature as in life. Edward was gone, but what we had built together, both tangible and intangible, continued. A legacy isn't just money, it is truth, it is justice, and it is the values we choose to hold. The green teacup remained on the snowy overlook, a small marker of remembrance. I didn't need to hold it anymore to feel its strength. That strength had transferred to me through months of challenge and growth, becoming part of who I now was, not just Edward's widow, not just a surprise CEO, but a woman who had discovered her own capacity to build, to nurture, to lead. I did not lose a family. I lost only the shadow of it. What I found is real, a community where worth is measured not by blood, but by kindness and love freely chosen. Spring would come, the lake would thaw, new voices would fill the cabin with questions, ideas, laughter. The company would continue evolving under my guidance. Marcus might or might not find his way back to authentic relationship. Life would unfold in ways I couldn't predict but now felt equipped to meet. For now, in this moment between what had been and what would be, I stood at the window watching light transform ice into diamond brilliance and felt not happiness exactly, but something equally precious. Purpose, continuity, the quiet satisfaction of honoring trust, the knowledge that love once given never truly ends but changes form, flowing into new channels, nourishing unexpected growth. Edward had seen this potential in me long before I recognized it in myself. His final gift hadn't been the money or the company or even the cabin. It had been the opportunity to discover my own strength, to emerge from shadow into full participation, to transform loss into creation. I turned from the window and moved toward the fire, toward warmth, toward the future that awaited not just acceptance but active shaping. The path ahead was neither easy nor certain, but it was mine to walk with newfound confidence. And somewhere, somehow, I knew Edward walked beside me, still not in body, but in the legacy of love that transcended death, that continued to guide and inspire, that remained alive in every choice to value people over profit, integrity over expedience, compassion over power. That was the true inheritance, not measured in dollars, but in difference made, not counted in properties, but in lives touched, not contained in legal documents, but carried forward in hearts and minds and daily decisions. An inheritance no court could grant or deny, because it had been mine all along, built through 40 years of partnership, strengthened through crisis, and now expressed through leadership that honored the past while creating the future. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward like prayers or promises. Outside, a chickadee landed on the porch railing, its small presence bold against winter white. Life continued, resilient, adaptable, beautiful in its persistence, just as Edward had believed I would be, just as I had proven myself to be.